Woohoo!
Been going through the 7 deadly sins.
Yep.
The corresponding 7 heavenly virtues.
We have.
We've made it through 4.
We have made it through 4.
So far, I've been pretty, I don't want to say impressed, but, they seem like they kind of, follow the principle of leading the good life a little bit.
Yeah.
There's some sort of internal consistency about them.
Yeah.
So, do you have any idea what I guess we're on the 5th deadly sin is?
There's like sloth. Right? Is that one of them?
It is one of them.
Lust. Is that one of them?
Lust. So, the next deadly sin, we're going to talk about just what every teenage daughter wants to do with her dad.
No.
Lust.
Oh my god.
Well, so what do you think the corresponding virtue is?
Virginity.
Close. I think essentially it's chastity.
Oh my
Chastity.
god.
It's interesting that it's included in a list of the 7 deadly ones.
I know.
Seems like it was a pretty big deal. Talk to me about lust in a modern sense and whether it's a sin or how or what that means.
Okay, well, lust in the modern sense is complicated, not as the, feeling, because the feeling is pretty, lust is just, wanting to have sex, right? I feel like that's pretty, I don't think there's any real double meaning to that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we use lust in a metaphorical sense now, like lusting after whatever.
I'm lusting after the dream.
Yeah, right. But yeah, given that its counterpart is chastity, I think we're pretty much talking about sexual lust.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But society's view on lust right now is sort of complicated. And it's been evolving for, a lot of years. Because, originally, and, back in the times when these sins were being made up, well, not made up, maybe made up's not the word. Back in the time when these sins were first emerging as sins, lust was this super bad thing, and it stayed that way for a long while because
what do you think they meant by that? Back then, or now, or whatever. I mean, what is it that they're saying is a sin?
My school uniform.
Yeah.
I have a school uniform I need to wear, but in the free days, we have a dress code, and it's you cannot show your knees because your knees are somehow sexual. And so for lust, it's not necessarily the feeling of wanting to have sex or the act of having sex. It is more so what society perceives as being sexual, and that is incredibly fickle.
There's a couple of points you bring up there. One, the definition in society of what is sexual and what isn't changes.
So often.
2, I think, though, and this is what I didn't hear you discuss, is society's attitude towards whether sexuality is good, bad, dangerous, needs to be curtailed or should just run free. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different opinions. I guess it would be it would be more traditional to, or at least more traditional, to consider that sexuality is a bad thing or should be kept in private. But a lot of people today are broadcasting their sexuality to the world.
Like we said, I mean, the modern conception of whether sex or sexuality is bad is, I mean, I don't think it would probably make the list of 7 deadly sins, right?
No way.
There's some things that you would just be that aren't necessarily bad, right? In modern society,
No.
maybe drinking alcohol or something. But I think that most people would feel well, if you do it to excess,
Mm-hmm.
it
should be kept in moderation.
Yeah, it should be in moderation. But I think with modern conceptions of sexuality, I think that even that is...
Yeah, no. They don't talk about keeping it in moderation.
Is this modern view towards sexuality, right? Where it's this sort of totally permissible, anything essentially, right? Is that an evolution in the sense of a change of like sort of a realization, and that's why we're changing our opinions on that?
I think that it is sort of like an evolution. I don't think it's like this huge mistake that people are making. Because I think people are like allowed to like do what they want with like their own bodies and stuff. And I don't think it's like a terrible thing to like I don't think sex is like inherently this like vile act. I think it's just like like something that you can do, and like some people like it and some people like take pleasure from it, and so like if you want to do that, if you want to, and if it's like a nice activity for you, then you should be allowed to do it, right? One thing I will say, something I've seen online, like people say like about porn.
Yeah.
It's sort of like there's a lot of controversy about it, and a lot of that is because number one, like some porn is like just like violent stuff. It lets like it's like it's like sort of like misogynistic, and like it allows, it like kind of perpetuates like rape and like these acts and like these like terrible things. And like Pornhub, people have like said, like I've like seen on the internet that people have said that people being raped, like videos of them being raped were put on the site and they weren't being taken down. And so and so it seems like porn in general could be incredibly harmful, like to like women especially, but just to like everyone, and sort of also like just like people watching it, like the idea that is being that is being shown to you could like encourage like more terrible things to happen.
I mean, I'm going to start pulling things apart out of, what you were talking about.
Okay.
One is the connection between sexuality and violence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like there is some sort of inherent or psychological or whatever it is connection between those two. What is the connect? Is there a connection, and is that possibly where morality comes in? Talk to me about that.
Well, a lot of people like get sexual pleasure from either like being hurt or hurting other people. But like in my opinion is like, as long as like it's like as long as it's like safe, as long as you're being like safe and like consensual and stuff, then like that's the like there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with it as long as like everything's okay. Like also like there's a lot of rape. There's a crazy statistic, like somewhere in like the 90% of women have been sexually harassed, and like 1 in 3 of every woman have 1 in 3 women have been like assaulted sexually.
No.
And it's insane to me how this isn't like a bigger issue. Like people say it a lot. People will say like, oh yeah, like this is like this big issue. But it's not like anyone's screaming on the street saying that it's the big issue. And it feels like it should be this huge issue that the world's talking about a lot, because it's still happening. As much as like sex is like, I don't think there's anything inherently dirty about it. With like this new influx of sexuality being talked about everywhere, being like proud, being like celebrated as something, you should always be sure, as well as like wearing sexy outfits, to be having the difficult conversations too, like what consent actually is and like how important it is.
And once again, you bring up a ton of important points there. I do want to talk about the one philosophical point I saw in some of what you said, and that is this connection between sexuality and violence.
Yeah.
Of course, me, I'm someone who just goes back to the biology and the evolution. I think that sexuality was a pretty inherently violent act.
Yeah.
Right? Like if animals, when they have sex, it doesn't look like it's extremely consensual.
No.
I mean, humans were at the very beginning very tribal, right? I mean, there was like some dominant grayback gorilla, and it ruled like, the roost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was, by ruling, that was clearly a sexual domination. Like that was, that one gorilla got all of the females, and there was no choice at all, right?
Yeah.
So there is a connection.
Yeah.
Right? So I guess I'm not totally shocked that some people still find they find it sexually exciting to to include some element of violence, whether it's real or play, into their sexuality. If it comes from nature like that, like, what is the countervening value that makes it wrong, or that we legislate it? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, how's it's so complicated?
Can I say something?
Yeah, of course.
Sexuality is connected to violence as we know of it now, but I don't think that it has to be. Because you bring up things like, like in the animal kingdom, like it's pretty violent and not necessarily consensual. And like, like in tribal times, like in caveman times or whatever, it could have been pretty violent. But we aren't animals as humans, as people. Like, we are not complicit to our base instincts. We are not in the caveman times now. We need to separate sex from violence in a way that we are completely capable from doing. We need to make sure that sex is like safe and it's completely consensual. Because like consent, like that's what a lot of the animals don't have, but that's what humans, us people, as with our brains, with our minds, are completely capable of having.
There's a lot of argument now that goes back to the way we were in nature, which is important. I mean, I think there's some important things to be learned from that.
Yeah.
But the fact is, we as human beings, as a species, have overcome some of what we are in nature. And it's been a good thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what this whole project's about a little bit, is getting us back to understanding whether we can continue to do that or whether there are things to be done that we can agree on, right? So I totally accept your argument that that human beings can overcome and become more than what they were in nature. Since you certainly seem to be of the opinion, and I think that most people are of the opinion these days, that what happens in your bedroom is your own business, right? It largely doesn't have moral consequences because it doesn't affect society or other people.
As long as it's consensual.
Right, as long as it's consensual. How did this get on number 7? Why was this so important then? Why was this central to their moral code?
In like Christianity, which is like where these sins kind of came from, it's sort of all about like being perfect. So it's like control at your most base, as your most primal level. It's like controlling yourself in controlling yourself and like sort of like putting yourself above like all those people that aren't Christians. It's putting yourself above like the animals. And one of the most base things, one of like the most base instincts of the animal kingdom is like sex. And so in having sex be like a sin, and in constantly like wearing modest outfits and like only like kissing once you're married and stuff like that, it is like the deepest level of control that you can get to, that you can have over yourself. Is the deepest level of control that you can have over yourself, and an excellent separator between you, the rulers of the animal kingdom, and the animal kingdom.
I think you bring up a great point. One of the reasons that lust was so prohibited during these times is because by controlling our natural instincts, it's a way to prove that we are different than the animals, that we're above them.
Yeah.
And that we're somehow spiritual. And that somehow, and I think this is most critical, possibly, can that spirituality or that spiritual essence of us can survive the demise of our physical being.
Yeah, it all comes back to the afterlife, doesn't it?
We can make a lot of mental contortions as human beings to believe something we want. Another reason, though, that that certain social prohibitions get put in place that may not be, part of these more natural virtues, right, is a word that you used explicitly is control.
Yeah.
And certainly, chastity being a virtue and lust being a sin had elements of social control as well, right?
Well, something that I notice in a lot of like sexuality and stuff, a lot of like the modest clothing you have to wear, a lot of like the only kissing once you're married, and a lot of the modern opinions about sex and sexuality is that there's always like one type of person that is sort of controlling the other type of person, and that is men and women. Because in sexuality, all the time, literally, it's all the time. It's always mostly on the woman to be modest. It's always on like the woman. It's always about controlling women and their bodies.
Now we're getting to a social aspect of this, right? That sexuality, and particularly the prohibitions on sexuality, have been largely along gender lines.
Yes.
What do you think a woman's economic status was in medieval times?
They didn't have any rights to own property, and in general, they were the ones being owned by their fathers or husbands.
Right. So we were in a transitional period where women were essentially property. Not only did they not have property status, they were property.
Yeah.
And what do you think back then and today a woman's most valued asset is?
Her sexuality.
That's right. If you look at the highest paid basketball players and athletes in America, right? They're paid the equivalent of the highest paid models who are women in America.
Yeah.
Not American women athletes. That's not as interesting.
No, people hate women athletes.
And also not the same for male models. Also not particularly interesting. So even today, a woman's sexuality is valued at about the same price as a man's athletic ability. What I think you're beginning to see here is that prohibitions on sexuality historically were about protecting a woman's economic value in the world.
Yeah.
Even today, women view their sexuality in those economic terms, right? Like it's something to be protected.
Yeah.
It's like an asset. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that women still feel that way because it's still true to some degree.
Right now, if you're a man and you've had sex with a lot of women, you are the top. If you are a woman and not even that you have had sex with like a bunch of men, if you have had sex with like a few men, if you have sex with multiple men, if you have lost your virginity, you're like an outcast.
Right, you're considered a diminished asset.
You're a diminished asset. That's exactly, in economic terms.
So I think that that sense of diminishment that society puts on women in terms of their sexual value ties into another element of sexuality, which I think is at the core of a lot of the violence, maybe even. Ultimately it is, but certainly a lot of the social control. And that is, there is a sense of exclusivity to it, or ownership.
Exactly.
Sexual partners, or most sexual partners, like to feel like they are the only sexual partner of that other person.
Even in what the majority of people view as like completely healthy and normal romantic relationships, there is that sense of ownership, of owning of one person owning the other, or more often those people owning each other.
The interesting thing to me is across the spectrum, there's still that sense of ownership, and it's fully socially encouraged and accepted.
Exactly.
We literally, like, marriage is like a pledge of essentially, exclusivity. So I think what we're finding out is this cardinal sin of lust is complicated.
It is complicated
in both psychological terms, biological terms, social terms. Obviously, it's got a complicated history. I guess that maybe makes sense then, that it would be something that would be included in the 7 deadly sins.
Yeah. I think that like lust in itself and sex and sexuality in itself is not a sin, and is not a deadly sin, and is definitely not even close to being a bad thing. But the way that society perceives what sex is right now, the violence that is associated with sex, the way that it is seen, the ownership of sex, like the way that people are assigned a value based on how much sex they have or haven't had, that seems sinful to me.
Let's talk about another element, since we're discussing the modern conception of lust versus the ancient conception of lust.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the modern conception of just, hey, sex is whatever, it's no big deal, is a reaction to sex is the most valuable thing in the entire world for a person, particularly a woman. But do you think we've gone too far?
I personally think that like the emotional and physical capacity you bring up, that is like important to be acknowledged, but I think that's like very subjective and relative to the people that are having the sex. Because, it's entirely, because like, for like, if you have like a long-term partner, then having sex with them could be like an expression of your love or something. But it doesn't have to be an expression of your love. I think that sex is like a complicated thing, and it's not quite as trivial as maybe society views it today, but also not quite as like deep and meaningful as the way you portrayed it just now.
I think that ultimately you're making the point that, and I think this is key, is sexuality is very individual.
Yeah.
Right? And people are sexually attracted to all sorts of different things and in different ways, and like to experience sexuality in different ways. And any consensus that tries to control the way that people express themselves sexually is probably not something that modern humans are going to be really particularly into. The question then is, I've asked this at the end of all of our virtue pairs, is this a product of the good life? Does this follow the same pattern of giving up our self-centeredness a little bit for a more universal perspective?
I think that lust, and not necessarily chastity, in the way that like lust in the way of like feeling like what you feel and like acting on those feelings as you want to, with like consensually, could lead to the good life.
The opposite, right?
The opposite,
yeah. So not really passing the test.
No.
Well, so just finished up talking about lust then.
Yeah.
And I think that this might be the first time we don't really feel like this is 100% something to be avoided for the good life.
Yeah, it was a very complicated issue, but it's definitely, at the very least, not as deadly as those other sins.
Right, at least we could say that. So next week, though, we're going to do one that's somewhere in the middle, and I don't know where we're going to end up on this one. It's gluttony.
Yep.
All right? So next week, Friday,
yeah.
Gluttony.
Come here next Friday to learn all about gluttony. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Right, like and subscribe.